As a child growing up, I was a very pragmatic kid. I understood what was real and what was impossible. So that meant when it came to the idea of ghosts or monsters under my bed, I was never one to be afraid. I knew that that sort of thing didn't exist. Now, this didn't mean that I never got scared. In fact, there was one part of my house that consistently scared the crap out of me. You see, I grew up in upstate New York in a house that had been built in the 1800s. It wasn't a particularly nice house, though. We ended up getting it for a really good price, and my parents had planned to fix it up. And it might have taken a while, but eventually the entire house had been renovated from the attic to the basement, and it all looked relatively new and fresh. However, any time any of us would go down into the basement to do laundry or to hang out with friends, things would always be fine until it was time to leave. It would be at that point that almost anyone I'd ever talked to that had been in the basement has said that they got chills and almost a dizzy feeling before ultimately running up the stairs as fast as they could. It's as if you get put in a daze and could feel someone watching you, and that had me petrified. I could ease my mind of the idea of ghosts, but an intruder in our basement was like a nightmare to me. So for the most part, I tended to stay away from the basement, especially if it was just me by myself. However, for my 13th birthday party, which was supposed to be out in my backyard, we ended up moving it into the basement because of a sudden change in the weather. Now, because of how many people were at the party, being in the basement wasn't a big deal, and honestly, there was no part of me that felt uncomfortable down there that day. At least, not until my friend Ethan screamed. This put us all on edge, and we all turned to Ethan to see what had happened. But when we looked over at him, he was just pointing behind the group toward a small storage room in the basement. He asked us who was in that room, and I didn't know how to answer him. I mean, there shouldn't have been anybody in that room. Thank goodness my mom was down there with us, because she chimed in and she said that no one was in the room and that it was probably just the cat or a shadow or something. No big deal. I felt bad for Ethan at the time, but we all couldn't help but laugh about the situation and how scared he got. Now, whenever I think back to this story, though, I wish I had his phone number so that I could apologize for mocking him. Because as the days went on, we had all basically forgotten about the incident at my birthday, and it just kind of turned into a bad joke. But a few weeks later, I ended up having a similar encounter. I was down in the basement grabbing out my bin of summer clothes since it was starting to warm up outside, and I made sure I knew exactly where the bin was so that I could get in and get out of the basement as fast as I could. The less time I spent down there, the better. I hustled down the stairs and made my way into the storage room, and the bin was right where I expected it to be. So I picked it up, I turned, and I began to walk out of the room and head back upstairs. But as I turned and began to take a step, I froze. In the blur of motion of the turning movement I made, I could swear that I saw something in the corner of the room. So I took a second, and I took a really deep breath, and I turned to get a better look at what I had seen. Thank God there was nothing there, at least not at that moment. I shook that feeling off and began to make my way out of the basement. But as I reached the base of the stairs, I got that feeling. All of a sudden, all of the hairs on my body were standing up, and I could feel the chills running up and down my spine. Someone was watching me, and whoever it was in the storage room. I slowly turned my head to look over my shoulder, and what I saw caused me to let go of the bin of clothes and sent me sprinting up the stairs 3 steps at a time. I was out of the basement in record time, and as I stumbled through the door and through it closed behind me, my dad, who was in the kitchen, came running over to ask me what was wrong. He wanted to know what had me so freaked out, so I told him. When I looked over my shoulder, standing in the doorway of the storage room was a hunched over man, and the only features that I could vividly make out were his bloodshot eyes and his yellow-stained teeth that peeked their way out through his evil grin. It must have been the look of pure fear on my face, but my dad knew that I wasn't messing around. So he told me to go and make sure my mom was okay and that he would handle it. A few minutes later, he came out of the basement and walked into he and my mom's room, and I don't think I had ever seen him so mad. He said that he wasn't sure if I was playing a prank or not, but there was no one down there. and there would have been no way for anybody to get out without going through the door that I had ran out of. There were no windows in that basement. I didn't know what to say to him, but I know what I saw. Clear as day, there was someone in my basement. There was no chance at me getting any sleep that night, and the entire time that I laid in my bed, I had my eyes fixed on the door. I was so afraid that it would open and I would see that man. Thankfully, nothing like that ended up happening, and the next day in school, I kept my eyes out for Ethan. As soon as I ran into him in the hallway, I had to ask him if he actually saw anything that day when he freaked out. And when I asked him, he pulled me aside and he quietly responded that what he saw was a man standing hunched over in my storage room. But when everyone started to laugh at him, he just tried to play it off as a joke so that he didn't seem like a total wuss. Now this all but confirmed that what I had seen was very real, at least to me. When I got home that day, I begged my dad to listen to me and that something wasn't right in the house, but he just kept getting upset with me about it. I didn't know what to do, and I mean, honestly, I don't think there was anything I could have done. My parents weren't listening to me, and there was no way I was going to the basement to confront whatever I thought I saw. So I just decided to stay away from that part of the house as often as I could, and any time that I was forced to go down into the basement, I made sure that I had at least one other person with me. And believe it or not, 15 years passed, and I managed to not have another incident like the one I had all those years ago. By this point, I had moved out and was living with my fiance when my parents let me know that they had sold the house and were moving to South Carolina to live closer to my aunts and uncles. I thought that this was a great idea for them, and when they asked me to help them move, I was more than happy to do it. I didn't even give it a second thought. So over the next week or so, we packed up everything they wanted to take with them into boxes and began moving it onto the moving truck. We cleared out just about everything in the house just fine, and there was only one box left in the basement. I didn't even think about it. It hadn't happened in so long at that point, so I just ran down the stairs and I got ready to pick up the box. No problem, right? Or so I thought. As I picked up the box, I got that same feeling I had all those years ago. And I knew if I turned back to the storage room, he would be there. So ever so slowly, I peered over my shoulder, and sure enough, standing in the doorway was the hunched over man with the yellow stained smile. I turned to face him without even thinking about it, and I just stood there, looking into his veiny, bloodshot eyes. I couldn't move. That's when he began to step out of the doorway and slowly cross the room in my direction. I wanted to run, but my body wasn't responding at all. That's when I was snapped out of my trance by a loud scream. I turned behind me and saw my mom, who was pointing towards the storage room, and when I looked back at it, the man was gone. My mom kept asking me who that man was, and all I could tell her was that I didn't know, but it's a good thing that they're moving. When we got upstairs and saw my dad, he asked my mom what was wrong, and she told him what we saw, and he looked at me and his face went pale. All I could do was shrug and tell them that it was time that we all left. To this day, not once have I ever thought about returning to that house.